The gavel struck the mahogany bench with the finality of a coffin nail, echoing through the packed courtroom like thunder. Judge Harrison Whitmore's voice boomed across the marble chamber as he delivered the verdict that would send an innocent man to his death. But what he didn't know was that his own daughter sat in the gallery, watching in horror as the father she'd revered her entire life condemned, a warrior whose only crime was being born with the wrong skin color. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Whitmore had always believed her father was the embodiment of justice itself. Today, she discovered that sometimes the law and justice were bitter enemies. And before this story ends, she would have to choose between the man who raised her and the truth that would destroy everything she thought she knew about her own past. The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of the Riverside County Courthouse, its neoclassical columns standing like sentinels guarding the promise of justice that had drawn Emma Whitmore to this profession. She climbed those steps every day with the same sense of purpose that had driven her through law school, through the bar exam, and into her position as a public defender in the same courthouse where her father presided as the most respected judge. In 3 counties. Emma had grown up in the shadow of those marble pillars, listening to her father's stories about the sacred duty of the law, about how the courtroom was democracy's last stand against chaos and corruption. Judge Harrison Whitmore was a legend in legal circles, 30 years on the bench, known for his fairness, his methodical approach to complex cases, and his unwavering commitment to constitutional principles. Politicians sought his endorsement. Law students quoted his opinions, and attorneys from across the state requested to argue before his court. The Whitmore name carried weight in Riverside County. Harrison's grandfather had been the town's first elected sheriff. His father had served as district attorney for 2 decades, and the family's law practice had defended farmers and merchants through the Great Depression. When Emma chose to become a public defender rather than join the family firm, her father had been initially disappointed, but ultimately proud. The law needs advocates on both sides, he'd told her. Justice depends on zealous representation for everyone, especially those who can't afford it. That philosophy had shaped Emma's entire approach to her work. She threw herself into every case with the intensity of a crusader, spending sleepless nights researching obscure precedents, interviewing witnesses that other attorneys would have ignored, and fighting for clients that society had already written off. Her colleagues at the public defender's office called her relentless. Her opponents called her naive. Her father called her principled. The irony wasn't lost on her that she often argued cases before Judge Whitmore's court. They maintained strict professional boundaries. During proceedings, he addressed her as Counselor Whitmore and never showed favoritism, but their dinner conversations at home frequently turned into spirited debates about legal theory, constitutional interpretation, and the evolving nature of justice in modern America. Emma's childhood had been spent in the elegant Victorian mansion on Elm Street that had housed 3 generations of Whitmores. The house reflected the family's position in the community, tasteful antiques, walls lined with law books, portraits of distinguished ancestors, and a dining room where visiting judges and prominent attorneys gathered for her father's legendary dinner parties. She'd grown up listening to those conversations, absorbing discussions about landmark cases, constitutional amendments, and the delicate balance between individual rights and societal order. The loss of her mother when Emma was 12 had only strengthened her bond with her father. Margaret Whitmore had died in a car accident during a winter storm, leaving behind a heartbroken husband and a daughter who found solace in following her father's footsteps toward a legal career. Harrison had thrown himself into his judicial duties while raising Emma with the help of their longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Patricia Kellerman, a stern but caring woman who'd worked for the family since before Emma was born. Patricia had filled many of the maternal roles in Emma's life, teaching her everything from proper etiquette to practical life skills that her academic father often overlooked. But it was Harrison who shaped Emma's worldview, who taught her that the law was humanity's greatest achievement, a system that could elevate society above its baser instincts and create true equality under principles of justice. Those lessons had driven Emma through her undergraduate years at Stanford, where she'd studied political science and philosophy, writing her senior thesis on the evolution of due process rights in American jurisprudence. Law school at Berkeley had been a natural progression, though she'd surprised her professors by choosing criminal defense over the corporate law track that most of her classmates pursued. Her father had understood her choice immediately. Someone had to stand between the state's awesome power and the individual citizens who found themselves caught in the legal system's machinery. The Riverside County Public Defender's Office occupied a cramped building 3 blocks from the courthouse. Its budget stretched thin across dozens of attorneys handling hundreds of cases. Emma's office was barely large enough for a desk, 2 chairs, and the filing cabinets that overflowed with case files. She'd been there for 3 years now, long enough to develop a reputation among local prosecutors as someone who never pleaded. Out a case without a fight, who investigated every angle, and who treated each client as if their life depended on her advocacy, because often it did. Her caseload that fall was particularly heavy. The county was experiencing a surge in drug-related arrests as federal authorities cracked down on trafficking routes that passed through their rural jurisdiction. Most of her clients were small-time dealers or users caught in sweeps designed to pressure them into providing information about larger operations. The cases were depressingly similar: poor defendants with limited education, often struggling with addiction, facing prosecutors who viewed them as stepping stones toward bigger fish. But among the routine drug cases and petty theft charges, one file stood out with an urgency that made Emma's stomach tighten every time she saw it. The defendant was Marcus Strongheart, a 28-year-old member of the Paiute tribe who'd been charged with the murder of Deputy Sheriff Daniel Morrison during what prosecutors claimed was a drug deal gone wrong. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Morrison's body had been found on tribal land with Strongheart's hunting knife buried in his chest, and several witnesses claimed to have seen the 2 men arguing shortly before the deputy's death. What troubled Emma wasn't the strength of the prosecution's case, but the speed with which it had been assembled. Morrison's body had been discovered on a Monday morning. Strongheart had been arrested by Wednesday, and the district attorney had announced murder charges by Friday. The investigation had been remarkably efficient, almost suspiciously so, especially given the complex jurisdictional issues involved when crimes occurred on tribal land. Strongheart himself was an enigma that didn't fit the prosecution's narrative. He held a bachelor's degree in environmental science from UC Davis, had worked for the Tribal Council's Natural Resources Department for 5 years, and had no criminal record beyond a single arrest for civil disobedience during an environmental protest. His family had deep roots in the community. His grandfather had been a respected tribal elder. His mother taught at the reservation school, and his younger sister was studying medicine at UCSF. The man Emma met during their first interview bore no resemblance to the dangerous criminal described in the prosecution's charging documents. Strongheart was articulate, thoughtful, and clearly devastated by the accusations against him. He maintained his innocence with a quiet dignity that impressed Emma, never raising his voice or showing anger despite the gravity of his situation. He answered her questions directly, provided detailed accounts of his whereabouts on the day of Morrison's death, and offered to take a polygraph test. "I've never even spoken to Deputy Morrison," Strongheart had told her during their second meeting. "I knew who he was, everyone on the reservation knew him, but we'd never had any interaction. I certainly never had any reason to hurt him." That claim had prompted Emma to dig deeper into Morrison's background and his relationship with the tribal community. What she discovered painted a troubling picture of a law enforcement officer whose approach to policing tribal lands had generated numerous complaints and formal grievances. Morrison had been involved in several high-profile arrests of tribal members, often for minor offenses that other deputies might have handled with warnings or citations. His reports frequently included language that tribal leaders considered inflammatory and culturally insensitive. More concerning were the rumors Emma heard from her contacts in the tribal community stories about Morrison's involvement in activities that went far beyond his official duties. Several sources mentioned seeing the deputy in locations and circumstances that seemed inconsistent with law enforcement work, though no one was willing to make specific allegations on the record. The pattern that emerged suggested Morrison might have been involved in activities that would have given someone a motive for murder, but not necessarily Marcus Strongheart. Emma's investigation into the case had revealed numerous inconsistencies and unanswered questions that the prosecution seemed eager to ignore. The crime scene had been processed with unusual haste, with several pieces of potential evidence either overlooked or dismissed as irrelevant. Witness statements contained discrepancies that hadn't been reconciled, and the timeline of events on the day of Morrison's death had significant gaps that no one seemed interested in filling. The most troubling aspect of the case was the pressure Emma felt from unexpected sources to encourage Strongheart to accept a plea agreement. The district attorney had offered second-degree murder with a 20-year sentence, claiming it was a generous deal given the strength of their evidence. When Emma had suggested they needed more time to investigate, the DA's office had made it clear that the offer wouldn't remain available indefinitely. Even more unsettling was a conversation Emma had with her father during one of their regular dinners. Judge Whitmore rarely discussed pending cases, but he'd made an exception to express his hope that the Strongheart matter would be resolved quickly and quietly. These cases that involve racial tensions require careful handling, he'd said. Sometimes, a swift resolution serves everyone's interests better than a prolonged trial that inflames community divisions. Emma had been surprised by her father's position, which seemed inconsistent with his usual insistence that every defendant deserved a thorough defense and due process. When she'd pressed him about his concerns, Harrison had cited his 30 years of experience with cases that had the potential to create community unrest. "Not every hill is worth dying on, Emma," he'd said. "Sometimes wisdom means knowing when to accept a reasonable compromise." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the case against Marcus Strongheart. The evidence felt too neat, the timeline too convenient, and the pressure for a quick resolution too intense. Every instinct she'd developed as a defense attorney was telling her that her client was being railroaded, but she couldn't yet identify who was behind it or why. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week, and Emma knew it would be her last chance to challenge the prosecution's evidence before the case went to trial. She'd spent the weekend preparing her arguments, reviewing witness statements, and developing theories about alternative suspects and motives. But as she sat in her office on Monday morning, reviewing her notes one final time, she couldn't escape the growing suspicion that the truth about Deputy Morrison's death was more complex and dangerous than anyone was willing to admit. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What Emma didn't know was that the case would ultimately force her to confront not just the flaws in the prosecution's evidence, but the foundations of everything she believed about justice, family loyalty, and her own past. The preliminary hearing would be the first step in a journey that would challenge her most fundamental assumptions and reveal secrets that had been buried for more than 2 decades. The morning sun was climbing higher, casting shorter shadows across the courthouse steps as Emma gathered her files and prepared to walk into what she thought was just another hearing. She had no way of knowing that before the week was over, she would discover that the man she was defending held the key to a truth that would shatter her world and force her to choose between the father she loved and the justice she'd sworn to serve. The preliminary hearing began with the kind of theatrical precision that District Attorney Robert Chamberlain was famous for. Chamberlain had held the office for 12 years, building his reputation on high-profile convictions and a zero-tolerance approach to violent crime. His silver hair and commanding presence made him a natural for television interviews, and he'd used the Morrison case to position himself for a rumored gubernatorial campaign. Emma watched from the defense table as Chamberlain laid out the prosecution's case with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted the outcome. His opening statement painted Marcus Strongheart as a dangerous radical who'd murdered Deputy Morrison during a confrontation over illegal drug activities on tribal land. The evidence, Chamberlain claimed, was overwhelming and undeniable. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chamberlain addressed the packed courtroom, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty, "we will prove that on the evening of October 15th, the defendant lured Deputy Morrison to a remote location under false pretenses, then brutally murdered him with a hunting knife. This was not a crime of passion, it was a calculated act of violence against a law enforcement officer who died protecting our community." Emma had attended dozens of preliminary hearings, but something about Chamberlain's presentation felt different. His usual theatrical style was replaced by an urgency that seemed almost desperate, as if he needed to convince not just the judge but himself of Strongheart's guilt. When he presented the physical evidence, the knife, Morrison's service weapon found 30 feet from his body, photographs of the crime scene, his hands moved with nervous energy that contradicted his confident words. The first prosecution witness was Detective Ray Sullivan, a 20-year veteran who'd led the investigation. Sullivan was known for his methodical approach to complex cases, but his testimony about the Morrison murder was surprisingly brief and lacking in detail. He described arriving at the crime scene, finding Morrison's body near a dry creek bed, and discovering the murder weapon partially buried nearby. The knife was identified as belonging to the defendant through serial numbers etched into the blade, Sullivan testified. Mr. Strongheart had purchased it from Riverside Outdoor Supply 3 months prior to the incident. Emma rose for cross-examination, her stomach tight with the anticipation that always preceded crucial moments in a case. She'd spent hours preparing questions designed to expose the gaps in the investigation, but Sullivan's answers were frustratingly evasive. "Detective Sullivan, how much time elapsed between the discovery of Deputy Morrison's body and the processing of the crime scene?" "Approximately 4 hours. We had to secure the area and wait for additional personnel." 4 hours during which the scene was potentially contaminated? "The area was secured according to standard protocol. But you testified that tribal police were the first responders. How many tribal officers had access to the scene before county investigators arrived?" Sullivan shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair. "I can't provide an exact number. Tribal jurisdiction complicated the initial response." Emma pressed harder, sensing vulnerability in the detective's reluctance to discuss the jurisdictional issues. "Detective, isn't it true that there was a dispute between county and tribal authorities about who had jurisdiction over this crime?" Chamberlain objected before Sullivan could answer, and Judge Whitmore sustained the objection. Emma noticed her father's expression seemed unusually stern, his typical judicial neutrality replaced by something that looked almost like irritation. The next witness was Dr. Amanda Chun, the medical examiner who'd performed Morrison's autopsy. Dr. Chun was known for her precision and attention to detail, qualities that had made her testimony crucial in dozens of murder cases. But her testimony about Morrison's death raised more questions than it answered. "The cause of death was a single stab wound to the chest, penetrating the heart," Dr. Chun testified. "Based on the angle and depth of the wound, the attacker was likely of similar height to the victim, approximately 6 feet tall." Emma made careful notes. Marcus Strongheart was 5 feet 8 inches tall, a detail that seemed inconsistent with Dr. Chun's findings. Dr. Chun, you mentioned the angle of the wound. Could you describe it more specifically? The knife entered at a slightly upward angle, suggesting the attacker struck from a position slightly below the victim. Would this angle be consistent with an attacker who was significantly shorter than Deputy Morrison? Dr. Chen hesitated, glancing toward the prosecution table before answering. It would be unusual, but not impossible. Emma's cross-examination revealed additional inconsistencies. Morrison's clothing showed signs of a struggle, but there were no defensive wounds on his hands or arms. The timeline of death was estimated between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m., but Morrison's radio log showed he'd called in his location at 9:15 p.m., 15 minutes after the latest estimated time of death. Dr. Chun, is it possible that Deputy Morrison was still alive when he made that radio call? Based on the physical evidence, no. The wound would have caused rapid blood loss and unconsciousness. Then how do you explain the radio transmission? Another hesitation. I can only speak to the medical evidence. Questions about radio logs would be better directed to the sheriff's department. Emma noticed that several spectators in the gallery seemed unusually interested in Dr. Chin's testimony. She recognized most of the faces: courthouse regulars, reporters, family members of the victim and defendant. But there were 3 men in expensive suits sitting in the back row who didn't fit the typical preliminary hearing audience. They took no notes, showed no emotional reaction to the testimony, and seemed to be watching Emma more than the witnesses. The afternoon session brought the prosecution's key witness, a man named Tommy Yazzie, who claimed to have seen Morrison and Strongheart arguing on the day of the murder. Yazzie was a known drug user with a lengthy criminal record, exactly the kind of witness that prosecutors often relied on in difficult cases. I was driving past the old mining road around 7 o'clock, Yazzie testified, avoiding eye contact with both attorneys. I saw the deputy's car parked near the creek bed and 2 men standing beside it. One was Deputy Morrison, and the other was Marcus Strongheart. They were arguing about something. Chamberlain led Yazzie through his story with practiced efficiency, establishing that the witness had a clear view of the confrontation and recognized both men. But Emma's cross-examination revealed significant problems with Yazzie's account. Mr. Yazzie, you testified that you recognized my client from a distance of approximately 100 yards. How well do you know Marcus Strongheart? I've seen him around. Everyone on the res knows everyone. But you've never actually spoken to him, have you? No, but I know what he looks like. Emma pulled out a photograph that showed 5 men of similar height and build, all members of the Paiute tribe. Can you identify Marcus Strongheart from this photograph? Yazzie stared at the image for a long moment before pointing to the wrong man. The error drew murmurs from the gallery and a sharp look from Chamberlain. Mr. Yazzie, the man you just identified is Robert Clearwater, who was in Los Angeles on the day of Deputy Morrison's death. Are you certain about your identification of the defendant? The witness's credibility crumbled under further questioning. Yazzie admitted he'd been drinking that day, had been arrested 3 times in the past year, and was currently facing drug charges that could result in a 5-year prison sentence. The implication was clear: Yazzie's testimony was being traded for leniency in his own case. But the most troubling moment came during a brief recess when Emma overheard a conversation between Chamberlain and one of the mysterious men in expensive suits. She'd stepped into the hallway to call her investigator when she heard familiar voices coming from an empty conference room. The witness is weaker than we anticipated, Chamberlain was saying. The defense attorney is more thorough than her reputation suggested. Then perhaps it's time to reconsider our approach, replied a voice Emma didn't recognize. We have other options for ensuring the desired outcome. Judge Whitmore has been cooperative so far, but even he has limits. If we push too hard, it could raise questions. Emma felt her blood turn cold. They were discussing her father as if he were part of some coordinated effort to convict Marcus Strongheart. She pressed closer to the door, straining to hear more of the conversation. "The girl is becoming a problem," the unknown voice continued. "Perhaps she should be reminded of what's at stake here. Her family's reputation, her father's legacy, her own career prospects. Emma Whitmore won't be intimidated easily. She's got her father's stubbornness. Everyone can be motivated, Mr. Chamberlain. The question is whether we use carrots or sticks." The conversation ended abruptly when footsteps approached the conference room. Emma hurried back toward the courtroom, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd heard. Someone was orchestrating Marcus Strongheart's prosecution, and they were willing to involve her father in their scheme. When the hearing resumed, Emma found herself studying Judge Whitmore with new eyes. Her father's rulings on her objections seemed less impartial than she'd initially thought. He'd sustained several prosecution objections that seemed questionable, while overruling defense motions that appeared legally sound. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable to someone who knew his usual judicial temperament. The final prosecution witness was Sheriff Malcolm Porter, a political appointee who'd held the office for 8 years, despite numerous controversies involving his department's handling of cases on tribal land. Porter's testimony about the investigation was brief and defensive, focusing on the physical evidence while avoiding questions about potential alternative suspects or motives. "Sheriff Porter," Emma began her cross-examination, "how many cases has your department investigated involving crimes on tribal land in the past 5 years?" "I don't have exact numbers, but several dozen." "And how many of those cases resulted in arrests of tribal members?" Porter shifted uncomfortably. "Most of them, I suppose." "Isn't it true that your department has been criticized by tribal leaders for what they consider biased law enforcement practices?" Chamberlain objected, but Judge Whitmore allowed the question. "There have been some complaints, yes. But we investigate all crimes equally, regardless of the race or ethnicity of the suspects." Emma pulled out a thick folder containing newspaper clippings and official documents. "Sheriff, I'm showing you what's been marked as Defense Exhibit. A series of complaints filed by the Paiute Tribal Council regarding your department's conduct. Are you familiar with these documents?" Porter glanced at the papers without really reading them. "I've seen some complaints, yes. According to these documents, tribal leaders have accused your department of harassment, excessive force, and conducting searches without proper warrants. How do you respond to these allegations?" "Those are just allegations. We follow proper procedure in all our investigations." Emma's questioning revealed a pattern of troubled relationships between the sheriff's department and the tribal community. Porter admitted that several of his deputies had been the subject of formal complaints, that his department had a high arrest rate for tribal members than for other county residents, and that Deputy Morrison had been involved in more controversial incidents than any other officer. But when Emma tried to ask about Morrison's specific activities in the months before his death, Judge Whitmore sustained a series of prosecution objections that effectively shut down that line of questioning. Emma noticed her father's increasingly harsh expression as she pressed the sheriff about Morrison's conduct. "Your Honor," Emma said after another sustained objection, "the defense should be allowed to explore the victim's activities that might have provided motive for his murder." "Counselor Whitmore," Judge Whitmore replied, his voice carrying an edge of warning, "you will limit your questions to the evidence relevant to this case. The victim's general conduct as a law enforcement officer is not on trial here. The ruling was legally questionable and tactically devastating." Emma had planned to use Porter's testimony to establish that Morrison had made numerous enemies through his conduct, any of whom might have had motive to kill him. Her father's intervention had effectively prevented her from developing that defense theory. As the hearing concluded, Emma felt a growing sense of unease that went beyond the typical anxiety of a difficult case. The prosecution's evidence was weak and contradictory, the key witness was clearly lying, and the investigation had been rushed and incomplete. But more troubling was the impression that powerful forces were working behind the scenes to ensure Marcus Strongheart's conviction, and that her own father might be part of that conspiracy. Judge Whitmore's ruling was swift and decisive. Based on the evidence presented, the court finds probable cause to believe that the defendant committed the crime of murder in the first degree. The case will proceed to trial. Emma had expected the ruling. Preliminary hearings rarely resulted in dismissals, but the speed and finality of her father's decision felt like a door slamming shut. As she gathered her files and prepared to leave the courthouse, she noticed the three mysterious men in expensive suits were already gone. Marcus Strongheart met her eyes as the bailiff led him away in handcuffs. In his expression, she saw not fear or anger, but a quiet dignity that reminded her of her father's descriptions of truly innocent clients. For the first time since taking the case, Emma was absolutely certain that Marcus Strongheart had not killed Deputy Morrison, but proving his innocence would require her to uncover the truth about Morrison's death, the forces working to convict an innocent man, and the role her own father was playing in what increasingly looked like a conspiracy. The preliminary hearing had ended, but Emma's real fight was just beginning. The drive to the Paiute Reservation took Emma through 40 miles of high desert landscape, past Joshua trees and weathered rock formations that seemed to guard the secrets of the American West. She'd never visited tribal land before, despite living her entire life less than an hour away. The distance between her world and Marcus Strongheart's suddenly felt like more than geography. Emma's decision to investigate the case herself had come during a sleepless night following the preliminary hearing. The overheard conversation between Chamberlain and the mysterious man haunted her thoughts, particularly the casual reference to her father as someone who had been cooperative so far. Every instinct she'd developed as a defense attorney told her that Marcus Strongheart was innocent, but proving it would require her to venture into territory that her legal education hadn't prepared her for. The Paiute Cultural Center sat at the heart of the reservation, a modern building that blended traditional architectural elements with contemporary design. Emma had called ahead and arranged to meet with Grace Strongheart, Marcus's mother, who worked as the center's education coordinator. She'd also requested a meeting with Tribal Chairman Joseph Littlefeather, hoping to understand the broader context of tensions between the tribal community and county law enforcement. Grace Strongheart was waiting in the center's main lobby when Emma arrived. She was a woman in her 50s with prematurely gray hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to assess Emma with the same careful attention that her son had shown during their jail meetings. Her handshake was firm, but Emma could sense the wariness beneath her polite greeting. "Mrs. Strongheart, thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know this must be an incredibly difficult time for your family. Please, call me Grace. And yes, it's been difficult, but not in the way you might think. Marcus has always been a strong person, and he's handling his situation with more courage than his father and I are managing." Grace led Emma through the Cultural Center, past displays showcasing tribal history, traditional crafts, and photographs documenting the community's evolution from 19th century treaties to modern sovereignty. The exhibits told a story of resilience and adaptation that Emma found both inspiring and sobering. Marcus grew up surrounded by these stories, Grace explained, stopping before a photograph showing tribal members participating in an environmental protection ceremony. "Our people have always understood that protecting the land means protecting our future. That's why he studied environmental science, why he chose to work for the Tribal Council's Natural Resources Department." They settled in Grace's office, a comfortable space filled with books, family photographs, and artwork created by local artists. Grace served additional pine nut tea while Emma explained her concerns about the prosecution's case. "I believe your son is innocent, Grace, but the evidence against him has been carefully constructed to appear overwhelming. I need to understand more about Deputy Morrison and his relationship with your community. Grace's expression darkened at the mention of Morrison's name. "That man was a cancer in our community, Ms. Whitmore. For 3 years, he made our lives miserable with his constant harassment, his assumption that every tribal member was a criminal, his complete disrespect for our sovereignty and our people." "Can you give me specific examples? Where do I start?" "Morrison would stop tribal members for driving while Indian literally. He'd pull people over for no reason other than their ethnicity. He'd conduct searches without warrants, claiming he smelled marijuana or suspected illegal activity. He'd arrest our young people for minor infractions that would have earned warnings if they'd been white kids from town." Grace pulled out a thick file from her desk drawer. "We documented everything, Ms. Whitmore. Every incident, every complaint, every time Morrison overstepped his authority. We sent formal letters to Sheriff Porter, to the county supervisors, even to the state attorney general's office. Nothing was ever done." Emma examined the documents Grace provided, finding a disturbing pattern of behavior that painted Morrison as someone who viewed tribal members as enemies, rather than citizens he'd sworn to protect. The complaints ranged from minor harassment to serious civil rights violations, including allegations that Morrison had planted evidence during searches and fabricated charges against tribal members who complained about his conduct. "Grace, in all these incidents, was Marcus ever involved? Did Morrison ever target him specifically? That's what makes this whole situation so absurd. Marcus went out of his way to avoid any contact with county law enforcement. He knew that. As a college-educated tribal member working in environmental protection, he'd be seen as a threat by people like Morrison. Marcus was always careful, always professional, always above reproach." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Chairman Littlefeather, a man in his 60s whose presence commanded immediate respect. He wore a simple button-down shirt and jeans, but carried himself with the dignity of someone accustomed to representing his people in negotiations with federal and state officials. "Ms. Whitmore, I appreciate you taking the time to visit our community. It's rare for attorneys from your world to seek our perspective on cases involving our people. Chairman Littlefeather, I'm trying to understand the broader context of Deputy Morrison's death. I believe someone is using your community's tensions with law enforcement to frame an innocent man." Littlefeather exchanged a meaningful look with Grace before responding. "Ms. Whitmore, what I'm about to tell you could be dangerous for both of us. Morrison wasn't just a racist cop. He was working with people who had financial interests in our land." Emma felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of financial interests?" 3 months before Morrison's death, our tribal council rejected a proposal from Westfield Development Corporation to lease mineral rights on our land. The company wanted to extract lithium deposits that recent geological surveys had identified. We refused because the extraction process would have destroyed sacred sites and contaminated our water supply. "What does this have to do with Morrison?" Grace answered, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Morrison was meeting with Westfield representatives regularly. We have photographs of him visiting their regional office, documents showing he received payments through a shell company they controlled. He was being paid to create problems for our community, to make us look like criminals who couldn't govern ourselves." Chairman Littlefeather continued the explanation. "The federal government can revoke tribal sovereignty if they determine we're unable to maintain law and order. Morrison was generating a paper trail of criminal activity, false arrests, planted evidence, fabricated reports, designed to justify federal intervention." Emma's mind raced with the implications. If federal authorities took control of tribal law enforcement, what would happen to mineral rights? Federal oversight would make it much easier for companies like Westfield to pressure us into accepting their proposals. Without sovereignty, we'd have limited ability to refuse development projects that federal authorities considered economically beneficial. The conspiracy Emma was uncovering was far more complex and far-reaching than she'd imagined. Morrison's death wasn't a random crime or even a personal dispute. it was connected to a scheme involving corporate interests, corrupt law enforcement, and the systematic undermining of tribal sovereignty. Chairman Littlefeather, if Morrison was working for Westfield, why would they want him dead? Wouldn't he have been more valuable alive? Perhaps Morrison became a liability. Maybe he was demanding more money or threatening to expose the operation. Or maybe his death serves their purposes better than his life did. Grace leaned forward in her chair. Think about it, Ms. Whitmore. Morrison's death gives Westfield everything they wanted. Our community is now associated with violence against law enforcement. Marcus, one of our most respected young leaders, is facing a murder charge. The federal government is already discussing enhanced oversight of our law enforcement capabilities. Emma felt a chill as she realized the full scope of what she was uncovering. And if Marcus is convicted, it provides the justification they need for federal intervention. Exactly. His conviction would be the final piece of evidence that our community is too dangerous to govern itself. Chairman Littlefeather stood up and walked to a map on his office wall that showed the reservation's boundaries and natural resources. Ms. Whitmore, the lithium deposits on our land are worth approximately $2 billion. Companies like Westfield will do whatever it takes to access those resources, including framing innocent people for murder. Emma stared at the map, understanding, for the first time, the true stakes of Marcus Strongheart's case. This wasn't just about one man's freedom, it was about the survival of an entire community's sovereignty and way of life. I need to ask you both something difficult, Emma said. Do you have any evidence that could connect Westfield to Morrison's actual murder? Grace and Chairman Littlefeather exchanged another look before Grace spoke. We don't have proof, but we have suspicions. Morrison had been acting strange in the weeks before his death, nervous, paranoid, looking over his shoulder constantly. He'd also been asking questions about tribal security protocols, wanting to know when certain areas would be unpatrolled. It was almost like he was planning something, Chairman Littlefeather added, or like he knew something was being planned for him. Emma spent the rest of the afternoon interviewing other tribal members who'd had encounters with Morrison. Each conversation added new details to the picture of a corrupt officer whose activities went far beyond harassment. Several witnesses described seeing Morrison meeting with non-tribal individuals in remote locations, receiving packages that he stored in his personal vehicle rather than turning over to the sheriff's department, and making phone calls during which he seemed agitated and defensive. The most revealing interview was with Rebecca Clearwater, a tribal council member who worked in environmental protection alongside Marcus. Rebecca had been conducting water quality tests near the disputed mineral sites when she witnessed something that had troubled her for months. I saw Morrison meeting with 3 men in expensive suits near the old mining road, Rebecca told Emma. This was about 2 weeks before he was killed. They were arguing about something, and Morrison seemed scared. I heard him say something about not signing up for this and wanting out. Emma's pulse quickened. Did you recognize any of the men he was meeting with? I didn't know them personally, but I'd seen them before. They were the same men who came to our tribal council meetings when Westfield was trying to pressure us into accepting their mineral rights proposal. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a coherent picture. Morrison had been working with Westfield to undermine tribal sovereignty, but something had gone wrong. Perhaps he'd gotten cold feet about the operation, or maybe he'd started making demands that his handlers couldn't meet. Either way, his death served multiple purposes. It eliminated a potential liability while providing the dramatic incident needed to justify federal intervention. But the most troubling realization was the sophistication of the frame-up against Marcus Strongheart. Someone with extensive knowledge of law enforcement procedures had planted evidence, coached witnesses, and coordinated with prosecution officials to build what appeared to be an airtight case. The operation required resources and connections. That suggested involvement from people in positions of authority. As Emma prepared to leave the reservation, Chairman Littlefeather pulled her aside for a private conversation. "Ms. Whitmore, there's something else you need to know. The men who killed Morrison, we believe they're still in the area. Several of our people have reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles and strangers asking questions about Marcus and his family. Your investigation is making someone very nervous." Emma felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. "Are you saying I'm in danger?" "I'm saying that whoever orchestrated this conspiracy has already committed murder to protect their interests. They won't hesitate to do it again if they feel threatened." Chairman Littlefeather handed Emma a small card with a phone number written on it. "This is my personal cell phone. If you feel unsafe, or if you need help, call me immediately. Our tribal police may have limited jurisdiction, but we protect our friends." As Emma drove back toward town through the darkening desert, she found herself checking her rearview mirror more frequently than usual. The conversation with Chairman Littlefeather had crystallized something she'd been trying to ignore her. Investigation was putting her in direct conflict with people who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill, but the evidence she'd gathered also strengthened her resolve to fight for Marcus Strongheart's freedom. The young man sitting in county jail wasn't just an innocent defendant. He was the target of a carefully orchestrated conspiracy designed to destroy his community's sovereignty and steal their natural resources. The most disturbing aspect of her discovery was the realization that the conspiracy required inside knowledge of law enforcement procedures and judicial processes. Someone with access to evidence lockers, witness statements, and case files had helped construct the frame-up against Marcus. Emma couldn't escape the growing suspicion that the corruption extended into her own professional world, possibly even to people she trusted. As the lights of town appeared on the horizon, Emma made a decision that would define the rest of the case. She would not only defend Marcus Strongheart, she would expose the entire conspiracy, regardless of where the evidence led or whom it implicated. Justice demanded nothing less than the complete truth, even if that truth destroyed everything she'd believed about her community and her family. Emma's investigation into the Westfield connection led her to places she'd never expected to go as a small-town public defender. Late nights in the county records office revealed a web of shell companies, property transfers, and mineral rights agreements that painted a picture of systematic corporate manipulation stretching back years. But it was her growing relationship with Marcus Strongheart that transformed her understanding of justice itself. Their attorney-client meetings had evolved into something deeper than professional necessity. Marcus possessed a quiet intelligence that reminded Emma of her father's best qualities, but without the institutional blindness that seemed to afflict career judges. He spoke about environmental science with the same passion that Emma felt for constitutional law, describing the delicate balance of desert ecosystems with a poetry that made her see the landscape around their town through completely different eyes. "The prosecution thinks they understand me because they've read my arrest record, which consists of one civil disobedience charge for protecting sacred sites," Marcus told her during one of their evening conferences. "But they don't understand that everything I've done in my life has been about preserving something for future generations." That's not the mindset of someone who commits random violence. Emma found herself staying later than necessary for these conversations, drawn by Marcus's perspective on issues she'd never considered. He talked about the responsibility that came with being educated in the white world while remaining connected to tribal traditions, about the weight of representing his community's hopes for the future, about the loneliness of being one of the few tribal members with advanced degrees. "Sometimes, I think the loneliest place in the world is being the bridge between two communities that don't fully trust each other," Marcus said during one particularly late meeting. "My own people sometimes see me as too assimilated, while the outside world sees me as too Indian." Morrison represented everything that makes that bridge feel impossible to maintain. Their conversations weren't limited to the case. Marcus asked Emma about her own experiences as one of the few women in county leadership positions. about the pressure of being Judge Whitmore's daughter, about whether she'd ever felt torn between personal convictions and professional obligations. Emma found herself sharing thoughts and feelings she'd never articulated to anyone, including her growing doubts about the legal system she'd devoted her life to serving. "I used to believe that the law was this pure thing," Emma admitted during one late-night session. "My father raised me to think that if we just followed proper procedures and constitutional principles, justice would naturally result. But your case is showing me that the system can be manipulated by people with enough power and resources." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Emma with the same careful attention he gave to environmental data. "Maybe the problem isn't the law itself, but the people who control how it's applied. Your father seems like a good man, Emma, but good people can be pressured into bad decisions when they don't see the full picture." The mention of her father triggered the anxiety that Emma had been trying to suppress. Her home life had become increasingly uncomfortable as she pursued leads that seemed to implicate county officials in the conspiracy against Marcus. Judge Whitmore had begun asking pointed questions about her investigation, expressing concern about her obsessive approach to what he considered a straightforward criminal case. "Emma, you're pursuing theories that could damage your reputation and career," her father had warned during a particularly tense dinner conversation. "The evidence against Strongheart is compelling. Sometimes accepting reality is more important than chasing conspiracy theories." But Emma's research had uncovered connections that made her father's advice seem either naive or something worse. Westfield Development Corporation had made substantial contributions to Judge Whitmore's last retention campaign, a fact that appeared in public records, but had never been mentioned in family conversations. More troubling were the property records, showing that the Whitmore Family Trust owned mineral rights on several parcels adjacent to tribal land, rights that would become far more valuable if Westfield gained access to the reservation's lithium deposits. Emma had discovered these connections late one night in the county clerk's office, using her courthouse access to examine records that weren't readily available to the public. The documents painted a picture of long-term financial relationships between her family and the very interests that seemed to be orchestrating Marcus's prosecution. She'd stared at her father's signature on mineral rights transfers until her eyes burned, trying to reconcile the man who'd taught her about justice with the evidence of his financial entanglements. The revelation had sent Emma to the courthouse law library, where she spent hours researching judicial ethics rules and conflicts of interest. What she found made her stomach sick. Judge Whitmore should have recused himself from any case involving Westfield or tribal mineral rights. His failure to do so wasn't just unethical, it was potentially criminal. But confronting her father about these discoveries felt impossible. Judge Whitmore had been Emma's hero her entire life, the moral compass that had guided her career choices and personal values. The possibility that he was compromised, or worse, actively complicit in framing an innocent man, challenged everything she'd believed about him and about herself. The emotional weight of these revelations was affecting Emma's ability to concentrate on trial preparation. She found herself making mistakes in other cases, missing deadlines, and struggling to maintain the professional facade that had always come naturally. Her colleagues at the public defender's office had begun commenting on her distracted behavior, and Emma realized she needed help processing what she was uncovering. The person she chose to confide in surprised her. Patricia Kellerman, the family's longtime housekeeper, had been a constant presence in Emma's life since her mother's death. Patricia had worked for the Whitmore family for over 25 years, and Emma trusted her discretion and judgment more than anyone else in her personal circle. "Patricia, I need to ask you something in confidence," Emma said one evening when she found the older woman organizing files in Judge Whitmore's home office. "Have you noticed anything unusual about my father's behavior lately? Any changes in his routine, his mood, the people he's been meeting with?" Patricia set down the papers she'd been sorting and gave Emma the kind of direct look that had made her such an effective maternal figure. "Child, your father has been carrying a burden for weeks now. He's not sleeping well, he's barely eating, and he spends hours on phone calls that he takes in private. Whatever's troubling him, it's serious. Has he mentioned the Strongheart case? Or anything about tribal land issues?" Patricia's expression became guarded. "Emma, there are some conversations I've overheard that concern me. Your father has been talking to people I don't recognize, people who seem to have a lot of influence over his decisions. Yesterday, I heard him arguing with someone on the phone about maintaining control of the situation." Emma felt her world shifting beneath her feet. "Patricia, I need to know, do you think my father is capable of doing something dishonest? Something that would hurt an innocent person?" The older woman was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with competing loyalties. "Your father is a good man, Emma, but he's also a proud man who's worked his entire life to build his reputation and provide for his family. Sometimes good people make bad choices when they feel cornered or threatened." "What do you mean, threatened?" 3 weeks ago, men came to the house when your father thought you were at work. They weren't friendly visitors, Emma. After they left, your father was shaken in a way I'd never seen before. He's been different ever since, distant, worried, like he's afraid of something." Emma's investigation had revealed the scope of the conspiracy against Marcus Strongheart, but Patricia's information suggested that her father might be as much a victim as a perpetrator. The possibility that Judge Whitmore was being coerced or blackmailed added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. That night, Emma made a decision that would fundamentally alter her relationship with both her father and her client. She would confront Judge Whitmore directly about his connections to Westfield and his handling of the Strongheart case. But first, she needed to understand exactly what leverage the conspirators might have over him. Her search through family financial records revealed the answer. 3 years earlier, Judge Whitmore had made a series of investments based on inside information about planned development projects. The investments had generated substantial profits, but they also represented clear violations of judicial ethics rules. Emma found documentation showing that her father had purchased properties immediately before zoning changes were announced, had invested in companies that later received favorable court rulings, and had accepted gifts from attorneys who appeared before his court. The pattern of ethical violations provided the perfect blackmail material for anyone seeking to control Judge Whitmore's decisions. Emma could imagine the conversation cooperate with the Strongheart prosecution or face public disgrace and criminal charges for judicial corruption. But the most devastating discovery came in a safety deposit box that Emma found records for but didn't initially remember. Using her father's spare key, which he'd given her years earlier for emergencies, Emma discovered a cache of documents that revealed the full scope of his compromise. The box contained photographs of Judge Whitmore in compromising situations, financial records documenting illegal transactions, and a letter from someone identifying themselves only as a concerned citizen who had been monitoring judicial misconduct for some time. The letter made it clear that the evidence could destroy Judge Whitmore's career and reputation unless he cooperated with certain requests regarding cases involving tribal land disputes. Emma sat in the bank's safety deposit box room, staring at evidence that her father was being systematically blackmailed. The revelation recontextualized everything she'd discovered about his handling of the Strongheart case. Judge Whitmore wasn't a willing participant in the conspiracy. He was another victim, trapped by his own past mistakes and forced to choose between his integrity and his survival. The discovery should have provided relief, but instead it deepened Emma's anguish. Her father's corruption was real, even if his current actions were coerced. The man who'd taught her about justice and integrity had violated the principles he'd spent his career defending. The trust between them was broken regardless of the circumstances that had led to his compromise. But understanding her father's situation also clarified Emma's own path forward. She couldn't save Judge Whitmore from the consequences of his past actions, but she could prevent him from being forced to participate in the destruction of an innocent man. Exposing the blackmail scheme would free her father from his manipulators, while providing crucial evidence for Marcus's defense. Emma's growing feelings for Marcus added another dimension to her decision-making process. Their professional relationship had evolved into something deeper, a connection that transcended the attorney-client privilege and touched parts of Emma's heart that she'd kept carefully guarded since her mother's death. Marcus represented everything she admired: integrity, courage, commitment to something larger than personal gain, while her father's situation embodied everything she feared about: the corrupting influence of power and success. The choice between family loyalty and professional duty that had seemed theoretical in law school was now painfully real. Emma would have to decide whether to protect her father's secrets or expose them in service of justice for Marcus Strongheart. The decision would define not just the outcome of the case, but the kind of person and lawyer she would be for the rest of her life. As Emma returned the blackmail materials to the safety deposit box, she realized that the next phase of her investigation would require her to become something she'd never been before: not just a defense attorney, but a detective, a whistleblower, and ultimately, a woman willing to sacrifice everything she'd known for the sake of truth and justice. The comfortable world of family dinners and professional respect was about to end forever. Emma Whitmore was about to discover that sometimes fighting for justice meant fighting against the people you loved most. The confrontation Emma had been dreading finally came on a rain-soaked Thursday evening when she arrived home to find her father waiting in his study, surrounded by the law books and family photographs that had defined her childhood. Judge Whitmore's face showed the strain of weeks of sleepless nights, and Emma realized that he knew she'd discovered his secrets. "We need to talk, Emma," he said without preamble, his voice carrying none of its usual judicial authority. "Close the door and sit down." Emma had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times, but facing her father's haunted expression made all her prepared arguments seem inadequate. She took the chair across from his desk, the same seat where she'd received countless lectures about responsibility, integrity, and the importance of doing what was right regardless of personal cost. "I know what you found," Judge Whitmore continued, his hands trembling slightly as he poured himself a glass of whiskey from the crystal decanter that had been a retirement gift from the Bar Association. "The safety deposit box, the financial records, the mineral rights documents. I know you've been investigating me along with everyone else connected to this case." Emma felt her carefully constructed composure cracking. "Dad, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you recuse yourself from Marcus's case when you knew about the conflicts of interest?" Judge Whitmore took a long drink before answering, his eyes focused on something beyond the rain-streaked windows. "Because I was a coward, Emma. Because I was afraid of losing everything I'd built, everything our family represents in this community. Because I thought I could manage the situation without anyone getting hurt. An innocent man is sitting in jail facing murder charges because of decisions you've made. How is that not someone getting hurt?" The accusation hit its target. Judge Whitmore flinched as if Emma had struck him physically, and for the first time in her life, she saw her father as something other than the pillar of strength and wisdom she'd always known. "You don't understand the full situation, Emma. The people behind this conspiracy, they didn't give me a choice. They have evidence of mistakes I made years ago, financial decisions that violated ethical guidelines. They threatened to destroy not just my career, but my legacy, our family's reputation, and your future in the legal profession." Emma leaned forward, trying to bridge the distance that seemed to be growing between them with every word. "Dad, being blackmailed doesn't justify participating in framing an innocent person. You taught me that justice sometimes requires personal sacrifice. I taught you a lot of idealistic nonsense That sounds noble in law school, but becomes complicated when real lives are at stake. Judge Whitmore replied, his voice carrying a bitterness Emma had never heard before. Easy moral choices are a luxury for people who don't have anything to lose. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening, followed by Patricia Kellerman's voice calling out that she was leaving for the evening. Emma realized that their housekeeper's departure would leave her alone with a father who seemed like a stranger, discussing secrets that could destroy both their lives. "Emma, there's something else you need to know," Judge Whitmore said after Patricia's car had pulled out of the driveway. "Something about your mother's death that I've never told you." The non sequitur caught Emma completely off guard. What does Mom's accident have to do with any of this? Judge Whitmore walked to the window, staring out at the storm that was battering the elm trees in their front yard. "Your mother's death wasn't an accident, Emma. She was murdered because she discovered something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden." Emma felt the room spinning around her. "That's impossible. Mom died in a car crash during a winter storm. There were police reports, insurance investigations, witnesses who saw her lose control on the ice. The ice wasn't natural, Emma. Margaret had been investigating irregularities in county land records, looking into why certain properties were being sold at below-market prices to shell companies. She'd discovered a pattern of corruption involving county officials, developers, and tribal land issues that goes back decades." Judge Whitmore turned from the window to face his daughter directly. "The night she died, your mother called me from her car. She was being followed by men who'd been threatening her to stop her investigation. Her car didn't slide on ice, it was forced off the road by people who wanted to silence her." Emma's mind reeled with the implications of her father's revelation. "You've known for 15 years that Mom was murdered, and you never told anyone? You never investigated? You never sought justice for her?" "I tried, Emma. I spent months following leads, gathering evidence, trying to identify the people responsible. But every path I pursued led back to the same conclusion. The conspiracy your mother uncovered was too big, too well-connected, too dangerous to challenge. The people who killed her made it clear that you would be next if I didn't stop asking questions." The pieces of Emma's family history were rearranging themselves into a pattern that made her feel sick. "So you made a deal with them. You agreed to be controlled in exchange for my safety." "I agreed to be careful, to avoid cases that might threaten their interests, to make decisions that served their purposes when absolutely necessary. For 15 years that arrangement protected both of us. But then the Strongheart case came along, and they needed more than my passive cooperation. They needed me to actively participate in framing an innocent man." Emma stood up abruptly, pacing to the bookshelf lined with her father's legal volumes and judicial awards. "Dad, do you understand what you're telling me? You're saying that everything I've believed about our family, about justice, about the legal system has been a lie for my entire adult life." "Not everything, Emma. My love for you is real. My pride in your accomplishments is real. My belief in the principles I taught you is real. But my ability to live up to those principles was compromised the day your mother was killed." Judge Whitmore joined Emma beside the bookshelf, pointing to a photograph of the three of them taken at Emma's law school graduation. "I've been trying to protect you from the truth about Margaret's death, but your investigation into the Strongheart case is bringing you into direct conflict with the same people who killed your mother. They won't hesitate to hurt you if they feel threatened." Emma touched the photograph, remembering the pride and joy she'd felt that day, believing she was following in the footsteps of two parents who represented everything noble about the legal profession. "Who are they, Dad? Who killed Mom and who's been controlling you all these years?" "The same corporate interests that are trying to steal tribal mineral rights today. Westfield Development is just the current incarnation of a network that's been manipulating land, deals and natural resource extraction in this region for decades. Your mother discovered that county officials were being paid to facilitate illegal transfers of tribal lands to private companies. Judge Whitmore pulled out a hidden drawer in his desk, revealing a file that Emma had never seen before. Margaret documented everything she found before she was killed. Names, financial transactions, property transfers, payoff schemes, evidence that could have brought down dozens of powerful people if it had ever been made public. Emma opened the file, finding her mother's handwriting on documents that detailed a conspiracy far more extensive than anything she'd uncovered in her own investigation. Margaret Whitmore had identified county commissioners, state legislators, federal officials, and corporate executives who were working together to systematically steal Native American land and resources. Why didn't you turn this over to federal authorities? Surely someone in the FBI or Justice Department would have. Investigated? Judge Whitmore laughed bitterly. Emma, some of the names in that file work for federal agencies. The corruption goes all the way to Washington, involving people who make decisions about tribal sovereignty, environmental regulations, and mineral rights. There was nowhere safe to take this information. Emma continued reading her mother's notes. Finding evidence of murders, disappearances, and suspicious accidents involving people who had opposed the land theft conspiracy. Margaret Whitmore had been thorough in her research, documenting a pattern of violence that stretched back to the 1970s. The people who killed your mother have been eliminating threats for 40 years, Judge Whitmore continued. Environmental activists, tribal leaders, honest government officials, investigative journalists, anyone who got too close to exposing their operation. I couldn't risk making you a target by seeking justice for Margaret's death. Emma looked up from the file, her eyes filled with tears that mixed grief for her mother with rage at the injustice that had defined her family's life. But now I'm already a target because of the Strongheart case. All your years of compromise and silence haven't protected either of us. That's why I'm telling you this now, Emma. The situation has changed. They're demanding that I sentence Marcus Strongheart to death regardless of the jury's verdict. They want me to use my judicial authority to ensure he never has the opportunity to appeal or expose what really happened to Deputy Morrison. The revelation hit Emma like a physical blow. They want you to murder Marcus from the bench. They want me to complete the frame-up by guaranteeing the ultimate outcome. And they've made it clear that refusing their demand will result in your death, just like your mother's. Emma closed her mother's file, her hands shaking with emotion that she could no longer contain. Dad, I can't let an innocent man die too. Protect me. Marcus doesn't deserve to pay for the conspiracy that killed Mom or the corruption that's controlled your decisions for 15 years. Judge Whitmore gripped his daughter's shoulders, his eyes pleading for understanding. Emma, if you continue investigating this case, if you try to expose the truth about Morrison's death or the forces behind Marcus's prosecution, they will kill you. I can't lose you the way I lost your mother. Emma pulled away from her father's grasp, walking to the window where rain continued to streak the glass like tears. You've already lost me, Dad. The man who raised me to believe in justice and integrity died the day you chose silence over truth. I don't know who you are anymore. The words hung in the air between them, creating a chasm that Emma realized might never be bridged. Judge Whitmore had revealed the truth about her mother's murder and his own compromise, but his confessions had destroyed the foundation of trust and respect that had defined their relationship. Emma, please, Judge Whitmore said, his voice breaking. Don't make me choose between your life and Marcus Strongheart's. Don't force me to watch another person I love die for principles that the world doesn't actually honor. Emma turned back to face her father, seeing him clearly for the first time in her life, not as the heroic figure she'd worshipped, but as a broken man who had allowed fear to corrupt his judgment and silence his conscience. You don't have to choose, Dad. I'm making the choice for both of us. I'm going to expose the truth about Morrison's murder, about the conspiracy against Marcus, about Mom's death, and about your 15 years of compromise. I'm going to trust that justice actually matters, even if you've stopped believing in it. Judge Whitmore sank into his chair, looking older than Emma had ever seen him. Then you're going to get yourself killed, just like your mother did. And I'll have failed to protect the only family I have left. Emma walked to the door of the study, pausing to look back at the man who had shaped her entire understanding of right and wrong. Maybe, Dad, but at least I'll die knowing that I tried to do what you taught me was right, even when it was difficult. Maybe that's worth more than living safely with a lie. As Emma left the study and climbed the stairs to her childhood bedroom, she realized that her family as she'd known it was over. Judge Whitmore's revelations had provided crucial information for Marcus's defense, but they'd also destroyed her faith in the man who'd been her moral compass for 28 years. The rain continued to fall as Emma packed a bag. Knowing she couldn't stay in a house where every photograph and memento now reminded her of the lies that had shaped her life. She was about to call Marcus's tribal attorney when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. "Ms. Whitmore," said a voice she'd never heard before. "We understand you've been having a difficult conversation with your father tonight. We think it's time for you to meet us in person." The meeting location they specified was the abandoned Riverside Mining Company office, a building that had sat empty for 20 years since the copper extraction operation had been shut down for environmental violations. Emma drove through the storm with her mother's investigation file on the passenger seat, knowing she was walking into a trap but understanding that confrontation was now inevitable. The parking lot was empty, except for 3 black SUVs arranged in a semicircle around the building's main entrance. Emma counted at least 6 men visible through the vehicle's windows, all wearing the kind of expensive suits that suggested corporate security rather than local muscle. As she parked her car, floodlights suddenly illuminated the area, turning the rainy night into an artificial day that made concealment impossible. The man who approached her car was someone Emma recognized from the preliminary hearing, one of the mysterious observers who'd watched the proceedings without taking notes. He was tall and lean, with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of wielding power without accountability. When he knocked on her window, Emma noticed his hands were manicured and bore no calluses or scars that would suggest physical labor. "Ms. Whitmore, thank you for coming. My name is Vincent Caldwell, and I represent certain business interests that have been monitoring your investigation into the Strong Heart case." Emma stepped out of her car, leaving the engine running and the driver's door open in case she needed to escape quickly. "Mr. Caldwell, I assume you're here to threaten me, just like you've been threatening my father for 15 years. Caldwell smiled with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to intimidating people through polite conversation. "Threats are such an ugly word, Ms. Whitmore. I prefer to think of this as an opportunity for reasonable people to reach a mutually beneficial understanding." He gestured toward the mining office building, where warm light now glowed through windows that had been dark for decades. "Shall we continue this conversation somewhere more comfortable? I believe you'll find our proposal quite generous." Emma followed Caldwell into the building, acutely aware of the armed men who flanked them as they walked. The interior had been transformed from an abandoned office into a temporary command center, complete with computers, communication equipment, and wall-mounted displays showing maps of tribal lands, mineral surveys, and legal documents. At the center of the room sat a conference table where 2 other men waited. Emma recognized District Attorney Chamberlain immediately, but the third man was a stranger whose presence commanded immediate attention. He appeared to be in his 60s, with the kind of expensive grooming and tailored clothing that suggested enormous wealth and influence. "Ms. Whitmore," the stranger said, rising to shake her hand, "I'm William Westfield, Chairman and CEO of Westfield Development Corporation. I believe you've been learning quite a lot about my company's interests in this region." Emma remained standing, refusing to accept the chair that Caldwell offered. "I've learned that your company has been stealing tribal land for decades, corrupting public officials, and murdering anyone who threatens to expose your operations. Westfield's expression didn't change, but Emma noticed that Chamberlain shifted uncomfortably in his seat. That's a very inflammatory way to describe legitimate business activities, Ms. Whitmore. We prefer to think of ourselves as partners in regional economic development. Partners don't usually murder their business associates. Mr. Westfield, you killed Deputy Morrison when he became a liability, and you've been threatening my father for 15 years because of my mother's investigation. The room fell silent, except for the rain drumming against the windows and the hum of electronic equipment. Westfield studied Emma with the cold assessment of a man evaluating a business problem that needed to be solved. Your mother was a remarkable woman, Ms. Whitmore, intelligent, determined, absolutely committed to her principles. Unfortunately, those same qualities made her dangerous to important business interests that support thousands of jobs and generate millions in tax revenue for this county. Emma felt rage building in her chest, but forced herself to remain calm. You're admitting that you killed her. I'm acknowledging that sometimes individual interests must be balanced against broader societal needs. Your mother's investigation threatened economic development projects that have brought prosperity to this entire region. Her death, while regrettable, prevented significant economic disruption. Caldwell opened a briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, placing it on the table between them. Ms. Whitmore, we're prepared to offer you a very generous settlement that would compensate you for any inconvenience. Our business activities may have caused your family. Emma glanced at the folder but didn't touch it. Let me guess, money. In exchange for my silence about Marcus Strongheart's innocence and my mother's murder. $5 million, Ms. Whitmore. Enough to pay off your law school loans, buy a house anywhere in the country, and establish a very comfortable lifestyle for yourself. All we ask in return is your cooperation in allowing the Strongheart case to proceed to its natural conclusion. Chamberlain leaned forward, his voice carrying the persuasive tone he used with juries. Emma, Marcus Strongheart is going to be convicted regardless of what you do. The evidence is overwhelming. The jury selection favors prosecution, and the judge, he glanced meaningfully toward the door, has already been convinced of the defendant's guilt. You can't save him, but you can save yourself. Emma finally sat down, not because she was considering their offer, but because she needed to understand the full scope of their operation. What about the tribal community? What happens to them after Marcus is convicted? Westfield smiled with genuine satisfaction. The conviction of a respected tribal member for murdering a law enforcement officer will provide the justification we need for enhanced federal oversight of reservation law enforcement. Within 6 months, we'll have negotiated mineral rights, agreements that will bring billions of dollars in investment to the region. And the Paiute people will lose their sovereignty and their sacred lands. The Paiute people will receive substantial compensation for mineral rights they're not currently utilizing. They'll benefit from job creation, infrastructure development, and educational opportunities that federal partnership can provide. Everyone wins, Miss Whitmore. Emma studied the 3 men around the table, recognizing them as representatives of a system that had been destroying indigenous communities for centuries. Their polite language and business suits couldn't disguise the fact that they were thieves and murderers who viewed human lives as obstacles to profit maximization. What if I refuse your offer? Caldwell's expression hardened slightly. That would be unfortunate, Ms. Whitmore. Your mother made the same choice 15 years ago, and I think you understand how that situation was resolved. The threat was explicit now, but Emma felt a strange sense of relief. The pretense of negotiation was over, and she could see her enemies clearly for the first time. You're going to kill me regardless of what I decide, aren't you? Just like you killed Deputy Morrison when he got cold feet about framing Marcus. Westfield leaned back in his chair, his facade of business courtesy finally dropping. Morrison was a useful idiot who thought he could change the terms of our arrangement. He wanted more money and threatened to expose our operation if we didn't meet his demands. Men like Morrison never understand that they're expendable. And men like you never understand that some people can't be bought or intimidated. Emma stood up, pulling her phone from her pocket and showing them the screen, which displayed an active recording application. Gentlemen, this entire conversation has been broadcast live to 3 different locations: the FBI field office in Sacramento, the Tribal Council headquarters, and a secure server maintained by an investigative journalist in San Francisco. The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate and electric. Caldwell reached for his weapon, but Emma was already moving toward the door. I also left copies of my mother's investigation files with the same people, along with detailed documentation of the conspiracy against Marcus Strongheart. Even if you kill me, the truth about your operation is already public. Westfield's calm demeanor cracked completely. You stupid girl. Do you have any idea what you've done? The economic implications alone. I know exactly what I've done, Emma interrupted, backing toward the exit while keeping her phone raised. I've exposed a criminal conspiracy that's been operating for decades. I've provided evidence that will free an innocent man and bring justice for my mother's murder. And I've honored the principles that my father taught me, even if he forgot them himself. Chamberlain stood up abruptly, his face red with panic. Emma, if this information becomes public, it will destroy dozens of careers, bankrupt legitimate businesses, create economic chaos throughout the region. Good. Maybe it's time for this region to build an economy that doesn't depend on theft and murder. Emma reached the door as Caldwell drew his weapon, but the sound of vehicles approaching at high speed made him hesitate. Through the windows they could see the flashing lights of multiple law enforcement vehicles: FBI, state police, and tribal law enforcement, all converging on the mining office simultaneously. It appears your broadcast was more effective than you anticipated, Ms. Whitmore, Westfield said, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and fury. I underestimated you, just like I underestimated your mother. The front door burst open as federal agents flooded into the building, weapons drawn and voices shouting commands for everyone to remain still. Emma raised her hands and identified herself, watching with satisfaction as Caldwell Westfield and Chamberlain were forced to the ground and handcuffed. Special Agent Lisa Hernandez, who led the FBI team, approached Emma with a combination of relief and urgency. Ms. Whitmore, are you injured? We received your transmission and mobilized every available unit, but we were afraid we might not arrive in time. Emma shook her head, still processing the surreal experience of watching 3 powerful men who had terrorized her family for decades being arrested like common criminals. I'm fine, Agent Hernandez. But there's something you need to know about Judge Whitmore's involvement in this conspiracy. We're aware of your father's situation, Ms. Whitmore. His cooperation with our investigation over the past week has been invaluable in building cases against the primary conspirators. Emma stared at Agent Hernandez in confusion. My father has been cooperating with the FBI? Judge Whitmore contacted our office immediately after your first visit to the tribal reservation. He provided us with documentation of 15 years of blackmail and coercion, along with evidence of the conspiracy to frame Marcus Strongheart. Your investigation gave him the courage to finally seek help. The revelation hit Emma like a physical blow. While she'd been struggling with her father's apparent corruption, he'd been working with federal authorities to build a case against his blackmailers. The confrontation in his study hadn't been a confession of weakness. It had been preparation for the final phase of an investigation that he'd initiated. Agent Hernandez, does this mean that Marcus's case, Mr. Strongheart, will be released tomorrow morning? The charges against him are being dropped, and the federal government is opening a comprehensive investigation into decades of illegal activities involving tribal land theft, judicial corruption, and conspiracy to commit murder. Emma felt tears streaming down her face as the full impact of the evening's events finally hit her. Marcus would be free, her mother's killers would face justice, and her father's 15-year nightmare of blackmail and coercion was finally over. But as she watched Westfield being led away in handcuffs, Emma realized that the conspiracy's collapse would have consequences far beyond the individuals involved. The systematic corruption that had defined her community for decades was about to be exposed, and the process of rebuilding trust and justice would take years. Agent Hernandez handed Emma a business card. "Ms. Whitmore, the federal government will need your testimony in multiple prosecutions over the coming months. Your courage in exposing this conspiracy has made it possible to seek justice for crimes that have been hidden for decades." As Emma left the mining office and drove through the storm toward town, she thought about the conversation she would have with Marcus when he was released from jail. They would need to discuss not just the legal case that had brought them together, but the future they might build together in a community finally free from the corruption that had poisoned it for so long. The rain was beginning to stop as Emma reached the courthouse, where lights were burning in windows throughout the building. Tomorrow would bring Marcus's freedom, her father's redemption, and the beginning of a new chapter for everyone who had been touched by the conspiracy's destructive reach. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Emma Whitmore could sleep peacefully, knowing that justice had finally been served. The morning sun streamed through the courthouse windows as Emma stood beside Marcus Stronghart, watching Judge Patricia Reynolds, the federal judge assigned to oversee his release, sign the order dismissing all charges. The moment felt surreal after months of fighting what had seemed like an impossible battle against overwhelming evidence and institutional corruption. Marcus emerged from the courthouse a free man for the first time in 4 months, blinking in the bright sunlight as tribal members, supporters, and media representatives gathered on the courthouse steps. Emma had expected to feel triumph in this moment, but instead she experienced a complex mixture of relief, exhaustion, and anticipation for the difficult work that lay ahead. "How does it feel to be vindicated?" asked Jennifer Walsh, a reporter from the Sacramento Bee who'd been covering the case since the conspiracy broke. Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't feel vindicated. I feel grateful. Grateful to Emma Whitmore for believing in my innocence when the evidence said otherwise. Grateful to my community for supporting me through this ordeal. And grateful that the truth finally came to light, even though it required exposing decades of injustice that affected far more people than just me." Chairman Littlefeather stepped forward to address the crowd that had gathered. "Today marks not just the freedom of one innocent man, but the beginning of justice for crimes that have been committed against our people for 40 years. The federal investigation that Emma Whitmore's courage made possible will examine every case of suspicious land transfers, every mysterious death, every instance of corruption that has stolen our heritage and murdered our leaders." Emma watched from the edge of the crowd as tribal members embraced Marcus, welcoming him home with a joy that made her heart ache with happiness. She'd grown to love this community during her investigation, drawn by their resilience, their commitment to each other, and their determination to preserve their heritage despite systematic oppression. But the celebration was tempered by the knowledge that Marcus's freedom was only the beginning of a long process of seeking justice for decades of crimes. Federal prosecutors had filed charges against 17 individuals connected to the conspiracy, including William Westfield, Vincent Caldwell, former District Attorney Chamberlain, and 6 county officials who'd been taking bribes to facilitate illegal land transfers. The investigation had revealed that the conspiracy extended far beyond Riverside County. Similar operations had been stealing tribal lands and resources across the western United States for decades, using combinations of corruption, intimidation, and murder to silence opposition. Emma's mother had been one of at least 12 people killed for investigating or opposing these land theft schemes. 3 days after Marcus's release, Emma sat in her father's study for the first time since their devastating confrontation. Judge Whitmore looked older but more peaceful than she'd seen him in months, as if the burden of 15 years of secrets had finally been lifted from his shoulders. "I owe you an apology, Emma," he said, settling into the chair across from where she sat, "not just for the lies and the secrets, but for underestimating your strength and integrity. You accomplished something I'd been too afraid to attempt for 15 years. Emma studied her father's face, seeing traces of the man who'd raised her to believe in justice, but also recognizing the scars left by years of compromise and fear. "Dad, Agent Hernandez told me you'd been working with the FBI. Why didn't you tell me that during our conversation?" Judge Whitmore sighed, running his hands through his graying hair. "Because I wasn't sure the FBI operation would succeed, and I was terrified that involving you would make you a target. I thought if I could discourage you from investigating further, I could protect you while still helping to build a case against Westfield and his associates. But you knew I wouldn't give up on Marcus's case." "I knew, but I hoped. Your mother had the same determination, the same unwillingness to compromise when innocent people were being hurt. I loved that quality in both of you, but I also feared it because I knew how dangerous it could be." Emma reached across the space between them to take her father's hand. "Dad, what happens now? With your career, your reputation, your future on the bench?" Judge Whitmore squeezed his daughter's hand, his eyes filling with tears he'd been holding back for weeks. "I'm retiring, Emma. Even though I was cooperating with federal authorities, my 15 years of compromised decisions can't be undone. I've agreed to resign from the bench and cooperate fully with reviews of every case I've handled that might have been affected by the conspiracy." The decision didn't surprise Emma, but it saddened her nonetheless. Judge Whitmore had been a good man trapped in an impossible situation, but his choices, however understandable, had contributed to injustices that couldn't be easily forgiven or forgotten. "What will you do?" "I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to make amends. The Tribal Council has asked me to assist with their efforts to recover stolen lands and seek compensation for decades of theft. It's not much, but it's something." Their conversation was interrupted by Patricia Kellerman, who knocked softly on the study door before entering with a message that surprised them both. "Emma, there's a young man here to see you. He says his name is Marcus Strongheart, and he has something important to discuss." Emma found Marcus waiting in the living room, looking uncomfortable in the formal setting, but determined to complete whatever mission had brought him to the Whitmore family home. He'd exchanged his jail clothes for jeans and a simple button-down shirt, but Emma thought he looked more handsome than she'd ever seen him. "Marcus, what brings you here? Is everything okay with your family, your reintegration into the community?" Marcus smiled, but Emma could see nervousness in his expression. "Everything's fine, Emma. Better than fine, actually. The Tribal Council has offered me a position leading our new legal advocacy program, working with federal authorities to investigate historical land theft cases and seek compensation for our people. That's wonderful news. You'll be perfect for that role, I hope so. But there's something else I wanted to discuss with you, something personal." Emma felt her heart racing, though she tried to maintain professional composure. "What is it, Marcus?" "Emma, over the past few months, our relationship has evolved into something that goes far beyond attorney and client. You risked your career, your safety, and your family relationships to fight for my freedom and expose the truth about these crimes. I've fallen in love with you, and I'm hoping you might feel the same way about me." The words hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of everything they'd experienced together, the late-night strategy sessions, the growing trust and intimacy, the shared commitment to justice that had brought them together and sustained them through the darkest moments of the case. Emma stepped closer to Marcus, studying his face and seeing in his eyes the same mixture of hope and vulnerability that she felt in her own heart. "Marcus, I do love you, but I want to make sure we're choosing each other for the right reasons Not just because we've been through this intense experience together. Marcus reached for her hands, holding them gently while he spoke. Emma, I love you because you're brilliant and brave and completely committed to doing what's right, even when it costs you everything. I love you because you saw past the evidence that made me look guilty and believed in my innocence when no one else would. I love you because you represent everything I admire about the legal profession and everything I hope for in a partner. Emma felt tears streaming down her face as she heard words that expressed feelings she'd been afraid to acknowledge, even to herself. Marcus, I love you because you've shown me what integrity looks like under pressure. Because you've taught me that justice isn't just an abstract principle, it's something worth fighting for, even when the cost seems unbearable. Because you've helped me understand that love and justice can work together instead of competing with each other. Their first kiss as free people, unburdened by the attorney-client relationship and the shadow of false charges, felt like the beginning of something entirely new. Emma had never experienced the combination of romantic love and shared purpose that she felt with Marcus, and she realized that their relationship could become a foundation for the kind of life she'd always dreamed of building. 6 months later, Emma stood before another crowd on the courthouse steps, but this time the occasion was celebration rather than crisis. The federal investigation had resulted in convictions for all 17 defendants connected to the conspiracy, with sentences ranging from 20 years to life in prison. William Westfield himself had been sentenced to life without parole for ordering the murders of Emma's mother and Deputy Morrison. More importantly, the investigation had led to the recovery of over 2 million acres of illegally transferred tribal lands across 7 western states, along with nearly $1 billion in compensation for stolen natural resources. The Paiute tribe had used their settlement to fund new schools, healthcare facilities, and environmental protection programs while maintaining complete sovereignty over their territorial jurisdiction. Emma had left the public defender's office to establish a private practice specializing in tribal rights and environmental law. Her first major case involved representing 5 other tribal communities seeking to recover land stolen through conspiracies similar to the one she'd exposed in Riverside County. The work was challenging and sometimes dangerous, but it allowed her to use her legal skills in service of communities that had been systematically oppressed for generations. Marcus had become the director of the Intertribal Legal Advocacy Coalition, a new organization funded by federal settlements and dedicated to investigating historical injustices against Native American communities. His work required extensive travel throughout the western United States, but Emma often accompanied him, finding that their professional missions complemented each other perfectly. Judge Whitmore had indeed retired from the bench, but his cooperation with federal authorities and his efforts to make amends had earned him a measure of redemption within the legal community. He now worked as a volunteer coordinator for tribal legal services, using his knowledge of judicial procedures to help communities navigate complex federal litigation. The relationship between Emma and her father had healed slowly but completely. They'd learned to talk honestly about the past while focusing on building a future that honored Margaret Whitmore's memory and the principles she died defending. Judge Whitmore's experience had taught both of them that integrity wasn't a permanent achievement, but a daily choice that required constant vigilance and courage. On a warm evening in late September, Emma and Marcus sat on the porch of the house they'd bought together on the edge of town, watching the sunset paint the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson. The property bordered tribal land, symbolizing their commitment to building a life that bridged different worlds while respecting the sovereignty and heritage of Marcus's community. "Do you ever regret the choices we made?" Marcus asked, his arm around Emma's shoulders as they shared the peaceful moment. Emma considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret the pain our investigation caused my father, and I regret that we couldn't save my mother or prevent all the suffering that conspiracy created." But I don't regret fighting for the truth, or falling in love with you, or choosing to build a life based on justice rather than compromise." Marcus kissed the top of Emma's head, breathing in the scent of her hair and the desert evening. "I love you, Emma Whitmore, not just for saving my life, but for showing me what it means to choose love and justice together, even when the world tries to make us choose between them." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The case that had begun with a simple murder charge had revealed decades of corruption, exposed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government and business, and ultimately led to justice for crimes that many people had believed would never be punished. But more than that, it had brought her together with a man whose values matched her own, whose courage had inspired her own growth, and whose love had shown her that it was possible to build a life that honored both personal happiness and public service. The desert wind rustled through the Joshua trees that surrounded their property, carrying with it the promise of challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. Emma and Marcus had work to do, communities to serve, injustices to expose, and a future to build together. But they also had something that neither the corruption of the past nor the uncertainties of the future could destroy. They had found each other, and in finding each other, they had discovered that love and justice weren't competing forces but complementary powers that could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. As they sat together watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky, Emma knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together with the same courage and integrity that had brought them through their first great test. The judge's daughter had defended the accused warrior, and in the process, they had both found something worth fighting for that would last far beyond any single case or victory. They had found a love rooted in shared principles, and a future built on the foundation of truth that no conspiracy could ever destroy. The morning sun streamed through the courthouse windows as Emma stood beside Marcus Strongheart, watching Judge Patricia Reynolds, the federal judge assigned to oversee his release, sign the order dismissing all charges. The moment felt surreal after months of fighting what had seemed like an impossible battle against overwhelming evidence and institutional corruption. Marcus emerged from the courthouse a free man for the first time in 4 months, blinking in the bright sunlight as tribal members, supporters, and media representatives gathered on the courthouse steps. Emma had expected to feel triumph in this moment, but instead she experienced a complex mixture of relief, exhaustion, and anticipation for the difficult work that lay ahead. "How does it feel to be vindicated?" asked Jennifer Walsh, a reporter from the Sacramento Bee who'd been covering the case since the conspiracy broke. Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't feel vindicated. I feel grateful. Grateful to Emma Whitmore for believing in my innocence when the evidence said otherwise. Grateful to my community for supporting me through this ordeal. And grateful that the truth finally came to light, even though it required exposing decades of injustice that affected far more people than just me." Chairman Littlefeather stepped forward to address the crowd that had gathered. "Today marks not just the freedom of one innocent man, but the beginning of justice for crimes that have been committed against our people for 40 years. The federal investigation that Emma Whitmore's courage made possible will examine every case of suspicious land transfers, every mysterious death, every instance of corruption that has stolen our heritage and murdered our leaders." Emma watched from the edge of the crowd as tribal members embraced Marcus, welcoming him home with a joy that made her heart ache with happiness. She'd grown to love this community during her investigation, drawn by their resilience, their commitment to each other, and their determination to preserve their heritage despite systematic oppression. But the celebration was tempered by the knowledge that Marcus's freedom was only the beginning of a long process of seeking justice for decades of crimes. Federal prosecutors had filed charges against 17 individuals connected to the conspiracy, including William Westfield, Vincent Caldwell, former District Attorney Chamberlain, and 6 county officials who'd been taking bribes to facilitate illegal land transfers. The investigation had revealed that the conspiracy extended far beyond Riverside County. Similar operations had been stealing tribal lands and resources across the western United States for decades, using combinations of corruption, intimidation, and murder to silence opposition. Emma's mother had been one of at least 12 people killed for investigating or opposing these land theft schemes. 3 days after Marcus's release, Emma sat in her father's study for the first time since their devastating confrontation. Judge Whitmore looked older but more peaceful than she'd seen him in months, as if the burden of 15 years of secrets had finally been lifted from his shoulders. "I owe you an apology, Emma," he said, settling into the chair across from where she sat, "not just for the lies and the secrets, but for underestimating your strength and integrity. You accomplished something I'd been too afraid to attempt for 15 years. Emma studied her father's face, seeing traces of the man who'd raised her to believe in justice, but also recognizing the scars left by years of compromise and fear. "Dad, Agent Hernandez told me you'd been working with the FBI. Why didn't you tell me that during our conversation?" Judge Whitmore sighed, running his hands through his graying hair. "Because I wasn't sure the FBI operation would succeed, and I was terrified that involving you would make you a target. I thought if I could discourage you from investigating further, I could protect you while still helping to build a case against Westfield and his associates. But you knew I wouldn't give up on Marcus's case." "I knew, but I hoped." Your mother had the same determination, the same unwillingness to compromise when innocent people were being hurt. I loved that quality in both of you, but I also feared it because I knew how dangerous it could be. Emma reached across the space between them to take her father's hand. "Dad, what happens now? With your career, your reputation, your future on the bench?" Judge Whitmore squeezed his daughter's hand, his eyes filling with tears he'd been holding back for weeks. "I'm retiring, Emma. Even though I was cooperating with federal authorities, my 15 years of compromised decisions can't be undone. I've agreed to resign from the bench and cooperate fully with reviews of every case I've handled that might have been affected by the conspiracy." The decision didn't surprise Emma, but it saddened her nonetheless. Judge Whitmore had been a good man trapped in an impossible situation, but his choices, however understandable, had contributed to injustices that couldn't be easily forgiven or forgotten. "What will you do?" "I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to make amends. The Tribal Council has asked me to assist with their efforts to recover stolen lands and seek compensation for decades of theft. It's not much, but it's something." There, conversation was interrupted by Patricia Kellerman, who knocked softly on the study door before entering with a message that surprised them both. "Emma, there's a young man here to see you. He says his name is Marcus Strongheart, and he has something important to discuss." Emma found Marcus waiting in the living room, looking uncomfortable in the formal setting, but determined to complete whatever mission had brought him to the Whitmore family home. He'd exchanged his jail clothes for jeans and a simple button-down shirt, but Emma thought he looked more handsome than she'd ever seen him. "Marcus, what brings you here? Is everything okay with your family, your reintegration into the community?" Marcus smiled, but Emma could see nervousness in his expression. "Everything's fine, Emma. Better than fine, actually. The Tribal Council has offered me a position leading our new legal advocacy program, working with federal authorities to investigate historical land theft cases and seek compensation for our people. That's wonderful news. You'll be perfect for that role. I hope so. But there's something else I wanted to discuss with you, something personal." Emma felt her heart racing, though she tried to maintain professional composure. "What is it, Marcus?" "Emma, over the past few months, our relationship has evolved into something that goes far beyond attorney and client. You risked your career, your safety, and your family relationships to fight for my freedom and expose the truth about these crimes. I've fallen in love with you, and I'm hoping you might feel the same way about me." The words hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of everything they'd experienced together, the late-night strategy sessions, the growing trust and intimacy, the shared commitment to justice that had brought them together and sustained them through the darkest moments of the case. Emma stepped closer to Marcus, studying his face and seeing in his eyes the same mixture of hope and vulnerability that she felt in her own heart. "Marcus, I do love you. But I want to make sure we're choosing each other for the right reasons, not just because we've been through this intense experience together." Marcus reached for her hands, holding them gently while he spoke. "Emma, I love you because you're brilliant and brave and completely committed to doing what's right, even when it costs you everything. I love you because you saw past the evidence that made me look guilty and believed in my innocence when no one else would. I love you because you represent everything I admire about the legal profession and everything I hope for in a partner." Emma felt tears streaming down her face as she heard words that expressed feelings she'd been afraid to acknowledge, even to herself. "Marcus, I love you because you've shown me what integrity looks like under pressure. Because you've taught me that justice isn't just an abstract principle, it's something worth fighting for, even when the cost seems unbearable. Because you've helped me understand that love and justice can work together instead of competing with each other." Their first kiss as free people, unburdened by the attorney-client relationship and the shadow of false charges, felt like the beginning of something entirely new. Emma had never experienced the combination of romantic love and shared purpose that she felt with Marcus, and she realized that their relationship could become a foundation for the kind of life she'd always dreamed of building. 6 months later, Emma stood before another crowd on the courthouse steps, but this time the occasion was celebration rather than crisis. The federal investigation had resulted in convictions for all 17 defendants connected to the conspiracy, with sentences ranging from 20 years to life in prison. William Westfield himself had been sentenced to life without parole for ordering the murders of Emma's mother and Deputy Morrison. More importantly, the investigation had led to the recovery of over 2 million acres of illegally transferred tribal lands across 7 western states, along with nearly $1 billion in compensation for stolen natural resources. The Paiute tribe had used their settlement to fund new schools, healthcare facilities, and environmental protection programs while maintaining complete sovereignty over their territorial jurisdiction. Emma had left the public defender's office to establish a private practice specializing in tribal rights and environmental law. Her first major case involved representing 5 other tribal communities seeking to recover land stolen through conspiracies, similar to the one she'd exposed in Riverside County. The work was challenging and sometimes dangerous, but it allowed her to use her legal skills in service of communities that had been systematically oppressed for generations. Marcus had become the director of the Intertribal Legal Advocacy Coalition, a new organization funded by federal settlements and dedicated to investigating historical injustices against Native American communities. His work required extensive travel throughout the western United States, but Emma often accompanied him, finding that their professional missions complemented each other perfectly. Judge Whitmore had indeed retired from the bench, but his cooperation with federal authorities and his efforts to make amends had earned him a measure of redemption within the legal community. He now worked as a volunteer coordinator for tribal legal services, using his knowledge of judicial procedures to help communities navigate complex federal litigation. The relationship between Emma and her father had healed slowly but completely. They'd learned to talk honestly about the past while focusing on building a future that honored Margaret Whitmore's memory and the principles she died defending. Judge Whitmore's experience had taught both of them that integrity wasn't a permanent achievement, but a daily choice that required constant vigilance and courage. On a warm evening in late September, Emma and Marcus sat on the porch of the house they'd bought together on the edge of town, watching the sunset paint the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson. The property bordered tribal land, symbolizing their commitment to building a life that bridged different worlds while respecting the sovereignty and heritage of Marcus's community. "Do you ever regret the choices we made?" Marcus asked, his arm around Emma's shoulders as they shared the peaceful moment. Emma considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret the pain our investigation caused my father, and I regret that we couldn't save my mother or prevent all the suffering that conspiracy created. But I don't regret fighting for the truth, or falling in love with you, or choosing to build a life based on justice rather than compromise." Marcus kissed the top of Emma's head, breathing in the scent of her hair and the desert evening. "I love you, Emma Whitmore, not just for saving my life, but for showing me what it means to choose love and justice together, even when the world tries to make us choose between them." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The case that had begun with a simple murder charge had revealed decades of corruption, exposed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government and business, and ultimately led to justice for crimes that many people had believed would never be punished. But more than that, it had brought her together with a man whose values matched her own, whose courage had inspired her own growth, and whose love had shown her that it was possible to build a life that honored both personal happiness and public service. The desert wind rustled through the Joshua trees that surrounded their property, carrying with it the promise of challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. Emma and Marcus had work to do, communities to serve, injustices to expose, and a future to build together, but they also had something that neither the corruption of the past nor the uncertainties of the future could destroy. They had found each other, and in finding each other, they had discovered that love and justice weren't competing forces, but complementary powers that could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. As they sat together watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky, Emma knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together with the same courage and integrity that had brought them through their first great test. The judge's daughter had defended the accused warrior, and in the process, they had both found something worth fighting for that would last far beyond any single case or victory. They had found a love rooted in shared principles, and a future built on the foundation of truth that no conspiracy could ever destroy. 2 years after the conspiracy's collapse, Emma stood in the chambers of the newly constructed Tribal Justice Center, a building that symbolizes everything their fight had accomplished. The center housed both traditional tribal courts and federal liaison offices, representing a new model of cooperative jurisdiction that respected sovereignty while ensuring access to justice for all community members. Emma's law practice had grown beyond anything she'd imagined when she first took Marcus's case. The Whitmore Strongheart Legal Alliance now employed 12 attorneys and had offices in 4 states, specializing in cases involving indigenous rights, environmental protection, and government corruption. Their success rate in recovering stolen lands and securing compensation for historical injustices had made them the most sought-after tribal advocacy firm in the western United States. Marcus entered the chamber carrying their 6-month-old daughter, Sarah Margaret Strongheart, named for both her grandmother and the woman whose courage had started their family's story. The baby gurgled happily as Marcus bounced her gently, her dark eyes bright with curiosity about the world around her. "How did the conference call with the Montana case go?" Marcus asked, settling into the chair beside Emma's desk while Sarah reached for the colorful dream catcher hanging nearby. "Better than expected. The timber company agreed to our settlement terms, complete restoration of the watershed, $40 million in compensation, and permanent protection status for the disputed lands. It turns out that having 18 federal felony convictions too point to makes corporate executives much more reasonable in negotiations." Emma smiled as she watched Marcus interact with their daughter, marveling at how naturally he'd adapted to fatherhood while maintaining his demanding schedule as director of the Intertribal Legal Coalition. Their marriage had been everything she'd hoped for, a partnership built on shared values, mutual respect, and genuine love that had only deepened through the challenges of building a family while fighting for justice. The wedding itself had been a celebration that bridged two worlds, with traditional Paiute ceremonies honoring Marcus's heritage, alongside elements that reflected Emma's background. Judge Whitmore had walked Emma down the aisle with tears in his eyes, proud of the woman his daughter had become, and grateful for the man who'd helped her find her true calling. "Speaking of settlements," Marcus said, Chairman Littlefeather called this morning. The final payment from the Westfield seizure came through, another $150 million that will fund the new educational initiative and the environmental restoration projects. Emma looked up from the legal brief she'd been reviewing, struck by the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I'd accepted their $5 million bribe that night at the mining office?" Marcus considered the question while adjusting Sarah's position in his arms. "Sometimes. But then I remember that you're not the kind of person who could have lived with that choice. Your mother's spirit was too strong in you, and your father's teachings about justice were too deeply rooted." The mention of Emma's parents brought mixed emotions, as it always did. Margaret Whitmore had been posthumously honored by the Tribal Council as a defender of Indigenous rights, and her investigation files had been donated to the Smithsonian as part of their collection, documenting resistance to government and corporate oppression of Native American communities. Judge Whitmore's redemption had been slower but ultimately complete. His voluntary cooperation with federal investigators and his dedicated work supporting tribal legal services had restored much of the respect he'd lost during the conspiracy years. At 72, he remained active in reform efforts, using his experience to help other judges recognize and resist corruption pressures. "Emma, there's something I've been thinking about," Marcus said, his tone becoming more serious. "The Foundation has approached us about establishing a scholarship program for Native American law students. They want to name it after your mother, the Margaret Whitmore Justice Fellowship." Emma felt tears welling in her eyes at the thought of her mother's name being associated with efforts to train the next generation of advocates for Indigenous rights. "That would be beautiful, Marcus. Mom would have loved knowing that her work inspired others to pursue justice for tribal communities." Their conversation was interrupted by Patricia Kellerman, who'd become an unofficial grandmother to Sarah and remained an essential part of Emma's extended family. At 78, Patricia moved more slowly than she once had, but her mind remained sharp and her devotion to the Whitmore family unwavering. "Emma, dear, you have visitors," Patricia announced. "Grace Strongheart and Dr. Amanda Chun are here for your 4 o'clock meeting." Emma had been looking forward to this meeting for weeks. Grace had been elected to the Tribal Council and was spearheading efforts to establish a traditional healing center that would complement modern medical services. Dr. Chen, the medical examiner whose testimony had helped expose inconsistencies in Marcus's case, had left her position with the county to pursue research into historical trauma and community healing practices. "Grace, Dr. Chun, please come in," Emma said, rising to greet the two women who'd become both colleagues and friends over the past 2 years. "Marcus was just telling me about the latest settlement payment. Your healing center project is fully funded." Grace smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd seen justice prevail after decades of struggle. "The center represents more than just medical services, Emma. It's a symbol that our community can heal from the wounds that conspiracy inflicted, while honoring the traditions that sustained us through the worst times." Dr. Chun had brought architectural plans for the healing center, spread them across Emma's conference table while explaining how the facility would integrate traditional tribal healing practices with modern therapeutic approaches. "We're particularly excited about the counseling programs for families affected by historical trauma. The conspiracy's collapse has allowed people to process grief and anger that they'd been carrying for generations. As they discussed the Healing Center's programs, Emma reflected on how the exposure of the land theft conspiracy had triggered broader conversations about historical injustices and intergenerational healing. Communities across the western United States were using settlement funds not just for economic development, but for cultural preservation and therapeutic services that addressed decades of systemic oppression. The meeting concluded with plans for Emma and Marcus to attend the Healing Center's groundbreaking ceremony the following month. As Grace and Dr. Chun prepared to leave, Grace pulled Emma aside for a private conversation. "Emma, I want you to know that Marcus choosing you as his partner has been a blessing for our entire community. You've shown that bridges between our worlds can be built on foundations of mutual respect and shared commitment to justice." After their visitors left, Emma found herself alone with Marcus and Sarah in the quiet chambers, watching the desert sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The beauty of the landscape never failed to move her, but now it carried additional meaning as the homeland of people she'd come to love and respect. "Marcus, do you think Sarah will grow up understanding the significance of what we accomplished? Will she appreciate the sacrifices that made her world possible?" Marcus shifted their daughter to his shoulder, patting her back gently as she drowsed in the evening warmth. "I think she'll grow up in a world where justice and love aren't competing forces, where fighting for what's right doesn't require choosing between family and principles. That's the greatest gift we can give her." Emma moved closer to her husband and daughter, wrapping her arms around them both as they watched the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. The Tribal Justice Center around them hummed with quiet activity, attorneys preparing cases, counselors meeting with clients, tribal elders sharing wisdom with younger community members. "You know what I realized today?" Emma said softly. "The night I overheard that conversation between Chamberlain and Caldwell, I thought my world was ending. Everything I believed about justice, about my family, about my community seemed to be crumbling." Marcus turned to face her, his expression tender in the starlight. "But it wasn't ending, it was being reborn. Sometimes things have to break completely before they can be rebuilt properly." Emma nodded, understanding that their love story was inseparable from the larger story of communities healing from historical trauma and building futures based on truth rather than deception. "I used to think that justice was about following rules and procedures. Now I know it's about having the courage to do what's right, even when the personal cost seems unbearable." As they prepared to leave the chambers and return home to the life they'd built together, Emma took one last look around the building that represented everything their fight had accomplished. The Tribal Justice Center wasn't just a legal facility. It was a monument to the principle that truth and love could triumph over even the most entrenched corruption when people had the courage to stand up for what was right. Sarah stirred in Marcus's arms, her tiny hand grasping at the star-filled sky, as if trying to hold the infinite possibilities that stretched before her. Emma knew that their daughter would grow up hearing stories about the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed her parents' communities, but she would also hear about the love and courage that had overcome that darkness. The judge's daughter had defended the accused warrior, and in saving him, she had saved herself, her family, and entire communities from decades of injustice. But more than that, she had discovered that the greatest victories came not from defeating enemies, but from building bridges between different worlds and creating futures where justice and love could flourish together. As they walked into the desert night toward home, Emma carried with her the knowledge that Margaret Whitmore's legacy lived on, that Judge Whitmore's teachings about integrity had found their proper expression, and that the principles worth fighting for had proven stronger than all the forces arrayed against them. The stars overhead seemed to whisper promises of more challenges and more opportunities to serve justice, but Emma faced them without fear. She had Marcus beside her, Sarah in their arms, and communities that trusted them to continue fighting for truth. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would meet it together, guided by love and sustained by the unshakable conviction that justice was not just an ideal, but a way of life worth every sacrifice required to achieve it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.